Thank you very much. Thank you, Shannon Stoll and everyone at ATT. It's more than a privilege to be here. I wrote my book to come and talk to you all. Buenos tardes, es un honor estar aquí a esta conferencia en Chile, un país magnífico. I'm speaking about your revolution from an outsider's point of view, and I want you to know and appreciate that. As Luis was very kind about my career, I'm a journalist. I think and write like someone who's concerned about foreign affairs and international economics, and I became fascinated with your industry about 7 years ago, and I've spent all that time researching and writing it so that I could do a book called Overbooked, The Exploding Business of Travel and Tourism. I had two audiences in mind: the general public, which didn't understand how important the industry is, both for doing good and doing a lot of bad, and you all. I wanted to tell the global tourism industry who it is, because as a reporter, I discovered your story hadn't been told. You didn't know your history, no one had done the research on your history, and you didn't know where you came from. And as a journalist and a historian, I believe that if you don't know your story, it's really hard to plot your future. So I went around the globe, Asia, Africa, where I ran into other people like Greg Carr, who redid a park in Mozambique, and so on and so forth, to the Middle East, to Dubai, a different story, Europe, South America, North America, etc. And then I chose a couple of countries to demonstrate what's good and bad, again with the belief that if you truly get into a country's history, you'd understand it. Costa Rica, yay, a superpower of biodiversity. How did it get that way? It didn't just happen overnight. It took several hundred years, really. Look at the history, the politics. It's a history of a country that, from the beginning, had a sense of conservation, a love of nature, nonviolence, and a willingness to balance the interests of everyone: business, government, locals, scientists. If you understand the history, you'll understand that it is no overnight accident that Costa Rica now has more butterflies than the entire continent of Africa, et cetera, et cetera. And you also know that it takes continued hard, thoughtful work to continue their work, that it's always going to be a work in progress. Another country I chose for the goodness was France, on the other side of the equation. France is now the country that has more foreign visitors than any other in the world. France. It's smaller than the American state of Texas. Why? Well, just as Costa Rica was taking care of its nature, France has been taking care of its culture, again for hundreds of years. It's always had a love of its own arts, support of the living arts, the love of their national heritage, and the willingness to do something about it, the stuff that makes other people go crazy, a real mind-numbing government bureaucracy that created the first Ministry of Culture, that has an expansive definition of culture, agriculture, et cetera. And it's also a country that has something called joie de vivre, a love of life. And it's the first country that had a guaranteed vacation. All this comes together to create a model, not a perfect model, but a model of tourism. And for you adventure people, it always ranks, if not the #1 country in skiing, right up there. So that's the good models. There's some bad models. Luis mentioned I have a long chapter on cruise ships. And as a journalist, I read all the studies and tried to boil it down, but I also went and talked to the people. So in the book, you see what the waiter says, who earns only $50 a month. And then I went to the corporate suites in Miami and interviewed the CEO, who makes $3 million a year. How does this happen? So it's part of what is now your modern industry. And I wish I could say that you're part of, yes, you're growing, but you're still less than 10%. The majority is still industrial strength tourism. But what's golden about your era is that tourism has only hit its stride in the last 2 decades, this century essentially. Before that, 2 world wars and the long Cold War closed off half of the countries from the other half because of politics. It's only now, in this new golden era, that you can travel essentially to every country in the world. That's important. It's also important that people now have the money to travel, thanks to the rise of the global middle class, not just China and India, but Chile, of course, Argentina, Brazil, and so many other countries. That all sounds great, but there's the downside that you've already heard of. The downside of overwhelming communities, destroying environments, et cetera, et cetera. And that's the poor reputation and the poor results that you're going to have to deal with. I wanted to just talk about 3 trends this year in tourism that I think are going to be important for you. The first jumped out at me when I was watching a baseball game. I'm from Washington, D.C. My team is the Nationals. On our stadium is on the Anacostia River, and you can see Congress. That's how politics is very much a part of us. And for the first time this year, I saw a banner promoting tourism. Tourism powering 1 out of every 9 American jobs, not just a pastime. Now, to me, that shows your industry, all of it, is trying to flex its muscle. It's trying to make the world aware that it is one of the top industries, that it employs more people than any other industry, that it generates $7.6 trillion to the global economy. But it also says that the industry doesn't want to stay on the sidelines anymore. Now, you all would like to think that you're more than a money machine, but most governments think of tourism as a money machine. They don't listen to you about things that matter: climate change, protecting the environment, bettering local communities, building good transportation systems. That's going to change, and it's your job to figure out how and to get involved in all those dirty politics. I think one of the reasons your industry is sort of quiet is you don't have a unified voice, not at all, and that you're having a hard time figuring out together how you're going to become a partner with governments, how you're going to have greater respect and partnerships that will lead to greater transparency and accountability. The second trend sort of came to me when something happened in Costa Rica. Our friend Rafael Gallo will know this story as Glenn Jampol of Finca Rosa Blanca. It wasn't long ago, a few weeks ago, that hundreds of olive ridley sea turtles were emerged from the Pacific Ocean to land on a beach in western Costa Rica. Now, this is something they've done for eons, but this time, when they waddled ashore, they couldn't go to the beaches. They were blocked by hordes of tourists. Tourists that jumped in the water and in some instances even jumped on the turtles themselves, taking selfies, crowding the sand, terrifying the turtles who turned back and went back into the ocean. One biologist said nothing in all of those hundreds of years had ever stopped the tortoises before, not even a tornado. That's the power of tourism. Now, it's every environmentalist's nightmare, and it happened in the home of ecotourism. How was that? Well, there was an unseasonably dry summer due to El Nino. Tour guides wanted to show the foreigners a great event, and things got out of control. But fortunately, it was Costa Rica. The Ministry of Environment stepped in, police cut off 4 of the 6 entrances, et cetera, so that when the turtles came back, a few weeks later, they could lay their eggs. This is not going to stop. There's going to be a lot of other these seemingly random but easily predictable problems. A tipping point around the world this year. In Barcelona, a mayor, Ada Colau, was elected on a taming tourism platform. She is examining cruise ships, trying to figure out what the carrying capacity is. She put a moratorium on short-term rentals. That's mostly B&B, which I know some of you probably have used, and it's beloved by consumers, but it's playing havoc with a lot of cities, destroying zoning, crowding the most beautiful parts of the city, turning one's nice little residential area into crazy tourist zones. That, again, the mayor of Barcelona said, we can't become another Venice. And finally, one of the tipping points was the newest members of the tourist class, Chinese tourists. This past year, China became the #1 country for exporting tourists, more tourists from China than any other country. Unfortunately, these newbies are not behaving as well as one would hope. There are entire websites of Chinese tourists behaving badly. I won't go into the story, but it's enough that the Chinese government now has a new law that if the citizens are caught doing horrible things, their passports are taken away for 2 years. That's how serious it's become. So look for your tipping points, be prepared, because the tourism revolt is underway. The third and final trend is my favorite, and that's tourism, a nice sector of the tourism industry that's rising to the challenge. And that came to me with Nepal. When 9,000 people were killed in that horrible earthquake in April, and huge sections of the country were in shambles, ATTA was one of the leaders in not only helping the tourism industry, but in helping Nepal itself recover. In fact, after this conference, ATTA is headed to Nepal for an adventure week, volunteering time, money, and expertise. Now, what's interesting is they're acting like a relief organization. They help direct money to groups like Mercy Corps. They helped publicize affiliate travel groups. They're going beyond traditional tourism. And Arnie Weissman, who will be joining us in a panel in a few seconds, he used his Travel Weekly magazine to do aggressive reporting on how the travel industry is contributing to the recovery. That's going beyond the bottom line of how many tourists have you brought in and how much money have you made. Even in a sort of a spontaneous gesture, do you remember this summer when two of the world's great population movements overlapped with Europeans vacationing on the Mediterranean, helping Syrian refugees fleeing war? You saw tour operators, tourists, giving them money and food and water in atmospheres that were not particularly friendly to those kinds of gestures. That tells me that there's a maturity and expansion beyond the bottom line, and looking at development strategies, which is really, really hard work. Now, I'm not saying this is true for all of mass tourism. They haven't got beyond the do no harm standard, but your sector is creating these new partnerships, and I'm very interested in tomorrow's panel showing us how the World Wildlife Fund and ATTA are making their partners. It has to happen pretty soon, because on the other side of that equation, the non-governmental side, there's competition. They are wanting to act like you, just like you're acting like them, and they want to start their own tourism business. Sierra Club, Nature Conservancy, National Geographic, every day I get a request if I want to take another trip with them. They're becoming tourism industry. They're offering travel, high-end travel, with the promise of environmentally sound educational travel. And they've even become a for-profit organization, with the Murdoch's 20th Century Fox buying National Geographic Media to turn it into a for-profit entity. Now, those of you who don't know the United States well, the National Geographic is one of the greatest old adventure travel entities we have. Historically, it was the first to talk about expeditions to the Arctic, about recovering a sense of where Egypt was, of the Panama Canal. Now it is another travel magazine for profit. So they're doing it to better their brand and boost their tourism sector. And in the summary, this is what the revolution is going to be. It's going to be conflicting and constant change, where environmental groups become tour operators become environmental groups. You're going to see increased regulation, crowd control, and planning from governments who are trying to keep one step ahead of you all. And finally, I think the one thing I took away from this year and the research in my book is that whether you like it or not, you're going to have to make the government your friend and figure out how to work together. Thank you.